Well, I want to welcome all of you who are watching. I am so, so delighted to introduce you to someone who's actually a very dear friend, as well as being a very cherished colleague, Janina Fisher. She's a PhD, and she is the Assistant Educational Director of the Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute and a former instructor at Harvard Medical School. She is an international expert on the treatment of trauma, and she's the co-author with Pat Ogden of Sensorimotor Psychotherapy, Interventions for Attachment and Trauma. And she is the author of a very wonderful book called Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors, Overcoming Self-Alienation. And I just read a forthcoming book. I had no idea. You are just never stopping. Called Transforming the Living Legacy of Trauma, a workbook for survivors and therapists. That sounds fantastic. She's actually best known for her work on integrating newer body-centered interventions into traditional psychotherapy approaches. So the reason why we're doing this brief little conversation is to give you just a little bit of a taste of her amazing presentation style, and just to give you a little bit of a tease, if you will, about the content that Janina will be presenting for the Ferentz Institute on Wednesday, October 28th. Her training is entitled Trauma and the Body, Somatic Approaches to Complex Traumatic Stress. I think, Janina, one of the only positive things about COVID and online everything is that I finally get you to be able to present for the Institute.
I know.
You don't have to fly and schlep across the country. We get you online. So it's the one bright light.
You're right.
All this craziness.
Yes.
So let's do this. Let me start by asking you, I know it's a question that in some ways is going to seem very simplistic, but I actually think it's so important, and I'm sure in many ways it speaks to the heart of what some of your content will be about at the workshop. And that is, why is it so important to understand the body as a part of trauma treatment?
You know, it's important because although it took decades to discover, post-traumatic stress is really a body issue, which is why, as you know, for all the years that we encouraged people to talk about what had happened to them and promised them it would set them free, it didn't always. And that often telling and retelling the story of what happened made people worse. And Bessel van der Kolk was one of the experts who got very curious about the fact that talking about the events wasn't having the effect that Freud promised us it would have, right? And he hypothesized this very strange thing, that the body keeps the score. And people thought he was nuts, right? How could he think such a thing? Right? But you know, Freud actually believed that someday a neurological or physiological explanation would be made for all the things that he described, like the id, ego, and superego, he believed would someday be found to have physiological correlates. Turns out Freud was right too. But over the years, really kind of obsessed with this idea, Bessel van der Kolk began to conduct research to prove that the body, more than the mind, was keeping post-traumatic stress disorders kind of locked and loaded. And you and I know that because it's been a mystery we've all been trying to decode over years. How do we help people unlock this seemingly unlockable post-traumatic trap they're in? So the research that Bessel conducted and others replicated showed that when people remembered trauma, the prefrontal cortex and the verbal memory centers shut down, and the nonverbal emotional memory centers became highly active. And as we began to have more and more brain scan research, it became clear that trauma doesn't just affect us emotionally, it also affects the nervous system. It primes the nervous system to be ready to fight, flee, or collapse and submit. And that those, the body, I know Bruce Perry talks about how the brain prioritizes survival above all else. So once the trauma is over, that sensitivity to traumatic reactions doesn't stop because the brain is operating on this better be safe than sorry principle. And then, of course, we put words to what we feel when these nonverbal memories are triggered, and we say, I'm afraid, or it's hopeless. And the more we say the words, the more the body responds to the words. And any of us can try this at home. If you're having a really good day and you say, I'm depressed, your body will start to feel heavy. If you're feeling really calm and serene, which is not always easy these days, right? And you say, I'm really nervous. I even just now demonstrating it, I could feel my heart rate go up. So the more we talk about how we feel, the more we feel it, which is great if they're feelings that help move you forward and transform your experience. But it's not so great when we're describing traumatic reactions and they're getting worse instead of better.
Yeah. And certainly so many of us see the somatization of trauma, right? With clients who have so many physical complaints. Right. And to put this in this new lens and really recognize that this is about trauma that's been truncated and stored on the body. So profound.
Absolutely. And another thing that I think is so important for therapists to understand, because therapists tear their hair out when faced with the clients who are numb, disconnected, shut down, never have a feeling that they can identify. And that's all body too. And when the therapist talks about so-and-so is avoidant, the therapist feels frustrated. The client feels inadequate because it's clear they're supposed to feel something. Mm-hmm. But it's really the body that's putting them in that total submission, shutdown state.
Right.
And if we can work with the body, we can actually help people feel themselves.
So important after, for many of our clients, a lifetime of living in a dissociated state, right?
Right.
Connected and numb.
Right.
It's interesting when we talk about, bringing on board body-based modalities. I think one of the concerns that people who are not familiar with those techniques and paradigms, one of the things that they maybe get worried about or curious about is, does it necessarily mean that we have to be touching the client in any way if we're talking about doing somatic interventions?
Absolutely not. And that was my fear originally. I thought, no way, I'm not going to do a body-centered training because I'm not going to use touch in my practice. But the modality that I use and teach, sensorimotor psychotherapy, is a body-oriented talking therapy. So there are ways you can use touch if you wish, but for us more traditionally trained therapists, most of us use the non-touch interventions, which is 90% of the repertoire, and we help the client learn how to manage and how to respond to these bodily reactions.
which is ultimately what they need to be able to do, right? To feel that sense of
Absolutely.
control.
And it's often less scary for clients than being asked to connect to their emotions.
Ah, interesting.
Right. So if I say, how are you feeling or what do you feel right now? Clients may be kind of like, oh, I don't know. But if I say, can you feel your feet? Clients are like, yeah, that was a stupid question. why are you asking that?
But I see that's less threatening, that's more accessible.
Exactly. Exactly.
So you're also alluding to, I think, the confluence of talk therapy with body-oriented interventions. And obviously you see that as very compatible. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I love about teaching this is that these are ways of working that are so easily integrated into traditional talking therapies. My client, I've never said to my clients, I'm using sensorimotor psychotherapy. They think, their perspective is I'm doing therapy. And it happens to include the body, not just feelings and thoughts. But they assume that's just what therapy is.
Mm. And I think actually, in a nutshell, Janina, you really kind of crystallized what I believe trauma-informed treatment is about, which is that combination of what are the thoughts, what are the emotions, and certainly what's going on somatically on the body.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I am thrilled that we're going to get 3 full hours with you in October.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I hope everybody who's listening already can appreciate and feel your wisdom, the tenderness and the compassion that you bring to the work that you do, along with years of incredible experience and expertise. So, again, if we're going to call ourselves trauma-informed therapists, I think it's essential that we have at least a basic understanding, right, of the
Yeah.
role that the body plays, how the memories are stored, and so that we can feel more competent and effective as clinicians in terms of learning how to work with the physical sensations that show up in session.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Good. Okay. We will see you
Okay.
on October 28th. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. See you then.
Be well. Bye bye.
Bye.